Hello, everybody. This is a rare pleasure. I'll be speaking to one of the true pioneers of the democracy reform movement today, Rob Richie. I've done this year roughly 30 interviews for the American Democracy Forum, and no one has more experience and is more influential in the reform space than Rob. So I'm truly pleased. Rob is the co-founder in 1992, which is quite a few years ago, of an organization called FairVote, which he will explain fully during this interview to the CityBiz audience. He's advanced many electoral forms in our country, including the Fair Representation Act in Congress, the National Vote Plan, and perhaps the most famous, which we'll explain as well, ranked choice voting, which is now the law in 2 states, Alaska and Maine, and I believe over 40, maybe over 50 cities around the country, plus many other reforms for democracy related to voter access and considerably more. So, and in addition to all that, as if that wasn't enough, Rob is the co-author of 2 books, Equal Vote, Every Vote Equal, I believe that's the name, and Whose Vote Counts, or Whose Vote Counts. Yes, I believe that's it. Anyway, Rob, thank you so much for being here with me. I appreciate you giving us the time.
Thank you, David, and just right back at you for all you do for the cause and the Fulcrum work and the Bridge Alliance. It's just, you've been a terrific ally and partner and thought leader yourself. So thank you.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. So I guess the first question, most people aren't aware of that, even that term, democracy reform. Most Americans just hear the standard narrative from the 2 parties that pretty much control the system, the Democrats and the Republicans. So what was your initial vision back in the 80s and 90s, before you even started FairVote, about what was the dysfunction or what wasn't operating correctly about our democracy that you saw that you felt should be changed? How did that all start?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that the broad context, when you think about the founders of this country and the Declaration of Independence, the creation of the Constitution, there was a lot of innovative thinking and action on democracy and representative democracy and what a republic means and so on. And they had the wisdom to recognize that it was an unfinished journey. We the people had places to go, and it's sort of this a more perfect union implies we're going to keep working on this. And really, if you look at the big changes to the Constitution, or the changes to the Constitution over the years, a lot of them have been about democracy. So this is not a new conversation, but expanding the franchise to more people, letting the Senate be directly elected rather than picked by the state legislators, moving the Electoral College to a system where legislators picked the electors to votes in states, and that's a journey that keeps going. And all of these journeys keep going, and then at times they become so intense that we have a more of a national conversation and change. As a young person, I was in the 60s, and I was sort of lived as a very young person through the Civil Rights Act and through the recognition that democracy was a burning question for a lot of people. And by the time of the 80s, I was someone who believed that we needed action on some big policies, concerned about the state of the world and ecology, and a big influenced by Buckminster Fuller and people like that, and sort of came to realize that the electoral process was a barrier to the fluid, big conversations we needed about thorny problems. And that kind of triggered an inquiry into what we could do that led to the ideas that became part of FairVote.
And what were you doing at the time? Were you an academic? Were you working in the business world? Were you a practitioner in the space?
Yeah. I majored in philosophy, so kind of like heading directly into like thinking about things, and was an activist and sort of like finding my way toward impact. So I was someone who came to this belief early that action was needed, and really went through the time in my 20s of kind of trying some different things. But I got introduced to electoral politics from my wife, Cynthia Terrell, who's the now my wife, but then was a girlfriend. And she was like really interested in like working on directly on elections. And I was kind of like, candidates, they're so disappointing often. And I want to work on issues. And she kind of showed that there's a bridge between what candidates and politicians can do and what change makers want to do. And yet that bridge isn't as strong as it should be because of the rules. So I actually was working on a political campaign and doing some local environmental work out in Washington State in the early 90s when I kind of connected with other people pre-internet who were interested in some of these same reform ideas. And we came together in Cincinnati in 1992 to start FairVote.
And when you started FairVote, did you have the vision of ranked choice voting in particular at that point in time, or did that evolve as you researched and created a plan for creating a healthier democracy? How did that major program of yours come about?
Yeah, the core founding goal initially was proportional representation, which you mentioned early on, our work on the Fair Representation Act for Congress, which is a form of proportional representation sort of based on voting for candidates and using ranked choice voting. And that's actually had been on the ballot in Cincinnati in 1991, and we had gone to work on that campaign, and that helped us connect with more people around the country around that idea. You very quickly realize that in the United States, though, so many big elections, you're electing only one person. A proportional system, which is based on dividing legislative power to better reflect voter opinion. So, 20% of voters can get 1 out of 5 seats. 51% gets the most seats, but not all the seats. That concept works for legislatures, but when you're only electing one person, doesn't really work. So actually, in our very first year, I worked with our then National Advisory Board Chair, John Anderson, who had run for president as an independent in 1980 after serving in Congress as a Republican. John was a really exciting, inspiring person, and he had run it and been a quote-unquote spoiler in the presidential election in 1980. And in 1992, Ross Perot was running and playing this same role of like, well, he's an independent, he's got a lot of support, but he can't win, but he's going to change the outcome in this whole way that our system doesn't really handle having more than 2 candidates. And so we had an op-ed. John had an op-ed that I worked with him on ranked choice voting in the New York Times back in the summer of 92. And so that always was a secondary piece because they're associated with proportional voting, but then as things moved along, sort of, accelerating into the impact of FairVote, which we've done work on a lot of other issues aside the election methods, but those two were the touchstones. Those were the foundational reforms. And ranked choice voting just ended up being more viable in more places, which is where we see them today. So proportional voting is a conversation, is happening in some places. Ranked choice voting is happening in a big way in a lot of places. So those have always been issues we've worked on.
Well, I'll get into the specifics about both ranked choice voting and proportional, but as a general philosophical concept, is there a basic principle there that in some way, somehow, those two systems or other systems you work on will lead to a less polarized system? Or is that totally off base and not really a part of the thought process?
Very much so. I would say it's interesting. When we started, the nation had come to a consensus that the two-party system wasn't working as well as it should be because the parties were quote-unquote hip-locked. They were too much in collusion. So the term limits movement, which is the idea that members of Congress can only serve a certain number of years and then have to leave, and you see that in a lot of state legislatures, but initially it was passed in a whole lot of races for Congress. In those years, 92 and 94, you had almost pretty much every state that had the initiative pass term limits as a response to this hip-locked concept. Ross Perot's candidacy was kind of a response to that also. Proportional voting, I would say, was this positive, voter-friendly response as well, which says, let's give us more choices from across the spectrum, and so that we can, resuscitate and revive and catalyze democracy to be what it hasn't been before. What's interesting is the problem over the next coming decades, I think, has had a consistent solution, which is, I think, proportional voting obviously continues to make sense to me. But now we see the parties as deadlocked, right? They're gridlocked. They don't work together. and the polarization that is reinforcing, right? This doom loop of the parties reacting to one another and each kind of getting more dug into their bunkers. That is very clearly addressed by a proportional system, which in its most fundamental impact is that it means that both major parties will win in the same place among the same voters. And the fact that here I am in Pacific City, Oregon right now, and not everyone here thinks the same. Like we're not going to want to be represented by necessarily one person. A proportional system allows multiplicity, pluralism, and then those people have different incentives to work together because they represent the same people. And when they come into office, different incentives to kind of find different allies on different issues and not just be sort of set in their red and blue Republican versus Democrat. So proportional voting is super impactful, as is ranked choice voting, because of the very basic reason that you can allow more than two choices. And the most successful candidates are ones who find themselves able to earn first choices, but be appealing as a second choice as well. So they've learned the language and the policy interests of backers of other candidates, and therefore they become more, at least somewhat more focused on consensus and more focused on solutions.
Well, maybe it's time to get into ranked choice voting a little, because as someone who's deeply involved in the reform movement, ranked choice voting is embraced by just about everybody I know, and it's really taken off, and it's seen as a potential major democratic reform, just not theoretically, but in reality, is gaining major traction. So why don't you explain to the City Biz audience what it means, how it works in the state of Maine or Alaska? What's different there than in the other 48 states in the country?
Well, it's one, your ballot is more inviting for you to show what you think. That's the first step. And the way it does that is it says you're not limited to a single choice. So ranked choice voting only makes sense, or only has impact when you have more than two choices, because it's fundamentally allowing you to indicate more than one preference, to rank your choices. So the ballot has to allow you to indicate a first choice and then a second choice, and then if you so choose, a third choice, and so on. As many candidates as there are, you have a chance to rank them first to last. You can stop whenever you want to. You're in control of your vote. But by that action, you're doing some important things. All ballots go all in with your first choice. And if you're electing one person, like in Maine and Alaska, they're using it in the presidential election. So let's say Donald Trump wins Alaska with more than 50%, and Kamala Harris wins Maine with more than 50% of these first choices. Then it's over, because they've won more than half the vote. But if not, if in either of those states the candidate with the most votes is under 50%, at that point the ranked choice ballot kicks into its impact, because the candidates who are trailing the field, who don't have a chance to win, they're out. And the voters who voted for those candidates, though, their vote isn't out. They get a chance to indicate their second choice. So they're not getting extra votes. They're just getting a vote in a new round of counting. So their ballots go to their second choice. So, let's just say it was just RFK running, though there's also other small parties running. And let's say his vote was like 5%, and the margin, and the two major candidates got 48% and 47%. RFK goes out, and then his ballots get counted for their second choice, and you have an instant runoff comparing the top two. And so you get a majority winner. You also have candidates be incentivized to win more votes. It really shows its impact perhaps most powerfully, though not as, not as openly, but actually more powerfully, is in like a nonpartisan race or a primary where there's a lot of candidates. And it's really rewarding candidates that are, often going from maybe only 35% of first choices all the way up to 51 or more, so that they've really connected with more voters. And it essentially it's making more votes count and rewarding candidates for listening and having an impact, or having engagement.
Right. Well, I don't want to get into too much of the intricacies, but let me see if I understand it correctly. If you had, in a primary situation, you had 6 people running, and in the second round, and let's say it was 40%, 30%, 20%, 15, 10, 10, whatever. So you have 6 people running. How do the voters have to not forced to, but they have the ability to vote a second time with less people on the second ballot than the first ballot. Is that how it works essentially?
Yeah, they just get to look at the other candidates and say who their preferences are. It's really easy for voters. Voters in ranked choice elections very quickly get it. You'll see, like, I don't know, 99.8% or 9% of people cast a valid ballot, meaning they don't make a mistake that invalidates their vote. And like 90% or so will rank someone second in races they care about. Arlington County is the most recent ranked choice voting election that I've noticed. It happened in June, and they were having a Democratic primary in the state of Virginia. And the top two candidates in a primary got 34% and 26%. So ordinarily, that's it. The candidate with 34% wins. In this case, there was 60% of the vote for the remaining three candidates. And those ballots ended up counting for one of the top two based on the voters' preferences who had supported those eliminated candidates. And almost all the voters chose to rank one of the top two. So the winner went from 34% to 55%, and you had a lot more votes count. There's no single change, actually, I have seen that makes more votes count, that results in more votes being part of the decision than ranked choice voting, more than automatic voter registration or a lot of things that I believe are good ideas. But this really makes a lot more votes count, and it rewards the candidates for just engaging with more people. Usually the winner not only is ranked, by a majority, but they are ranked by a lot of the people that back the candidate in second. So you usually are ranked first, second, or third by 70, 75% of voters, and that shows you've done some work. You have tried to connect with more people.
Well, let me ask you another question on this, and we'll move on to other subjects, because you have so much knowledge about so many aspects of the democracy in general and the democracy reform movement. Let's say there's a listener and they are fascinated. They do a little research and they say, "This is something I want in their city in Wisconsin or New Jersey." What do they do? How do they go about effectuating something like this? Do they contact FairVote, or what's the process?
FairVote's a great place to get information and to learn about how to get connected. And we have FairVote on the sort of educational research side, and then we have FairVote Action, which tries to channel people into chances to be part of winning change. And what's exciting for me, compared to just even 10 years ago, let alone 30 years ago, is we have so many more people making change happen and different groups doing different things. There's a group called Rank the Vote, which is, I would say, the primary connector with people trying to get groups going in states. And there's 35 states have really active ranked choice voting state groups right now. You have more partner groups that maybe work on other issues, like Unite America does a lot of work on other issues, but they really come in and help in a big way when you might have a statewide ballot measure. There's 4 states voting on ranked choice voting this November. And more can do that. But a lot of cities, as you mentioned at the start, are having this conversation. Several cities will have it on the ballot. There could be, 100, 200, 300 cities over the next 2, 3, 4 years having serious conversations about this. So it can happen at all levels. It can happen in your organization. One of the fun things I like to see is we're up to more than 100 colleges and universities where students have just gone through the process, which is usually somewhat involved, to change their student elections to ranked choice voting. And I think it's a sign that no matter what we do about ranked choice voting now, it's where we're heading. It's where young people want to go.
That's fascinating. Well, I know your role has changed considerably. I think you were the co-founder, and I don't know the official title, executive director, president for many years, but you were deeply involved in the day-to-day operations, and you recently have retired from that day-to-day operational role, but I know you're not riding off into the sunset and forgetting about our democracy. What are your new, and not necessarily initiatives, but how do you see your role as someone who not only knows a lot about ranked choice voting, but has an understanding of the movement as a whole? Do you have a sense of what role you could play in helping this ecosystem develop and evolve?
Yeah, let me just say, it's interesting. I work in elections. I see a lot of things what governments do. Pretty much every governor can only serve 8 years, right? That's often true for mayors. We have an expectation that there's value in turnover, in in new infusions of leadership. NGO leaders often don't have that, right? And you can have, and it's sort of up to you and your board of directors. I mean, if you're doing a bad job, you're going to leave your job. FairVote's been growing. FairVote's been doing really well, but at the same time, I'd been there a long time. We had a lot of talent in the organization, in the movement, and the board and I decided that, that concept of turnover, passing the torch, is good for an organization as well. And it doesn't mean I'm off to retire, to not doing this work. It's really saying, hey, there was a place and time for me to do this entrepreneurial organizational building work to help an organization grow from just me and a couple people, volunteers and things, to 30, and a much, much bigger budget than we had before. And, the skill set to do that kind of evolves, and my interest continues to be, I love to catalyze ideas and strategies. I'm going to be working with I'm working a lot with FairVote still. I'm a senior advisor, and that's my main job. But I expect to continue to have a relationship with FairVote, but I'm also going to be, kind of a voice, a helper to a lot more organizations, or at least some more organizations, and really try to be someone helping the movement as a whole advance. And just making space to do some of the writing that I want to do, sort of seed gaps that I think I can contribute to. And I've always loved catalyzing new ideas in reform work. So National Popular Vote Plan was someone else's idea, but I did a lot to kind of popularize it. Lowering the voting age to 16 is an exciting change that we have some cities doing, but lots of countries are now doing it, including the United Kingdom is almost certainly going to change it next year. And it's a conversation that we can have. So I have a LLC called Democracy Next, and I'll probably form a little nonprofit to do that. And it's all in the spirit of democracy is an ongoing conversation, and this for a more perfect union. I'm going to be try to do my part to further that.
Interesting. Well, I have a question for you. That's a question for myself as well that I ask myself a lot. I think you use the term movement. And, the democracy, and I always use the quotes, reform movement. But I ask myself, are we a movement? I mean, it's very easy to define, the women's right movement or the civil rights movement. I mean, it's very specific, but the democracy reform movement, well, first of all, you have the organizations dealing with actual reforms, whether it's campaign financing reform or the election reforms like you do, or voter registration. But then there's a big part of our quote unquote movement that's more involved with the cultural side, the bridging divide, finding common ground. Do you think we really are a movement, or is it so varied and disparate that maybe we should not think of ourselves as a movement and we're just many directions trying to improve our democracy?
I think it's a really insightful question, from lived experience, I'm sure, of thinking about how to bring people together. And I think you'll have maybe more focused, defined movements within this broader pro-democracy vision of that we, the people in the United States, create a government that operates by the consent of the governed, and there's so much to do to make that work. And we have so many different, elected offices, 500,000 elected offices, and, all these layers of government. There's a lot of ways you can participate. You can not just vote, you can be a poll worker, you can get involved on a committee in your city, and there are so many ways to make democracy work, and you can have these bridging conversations and try to deliberative democracy experiments and so on. I feel that's all of a movement that's not a coordinated, united movement that finishes its work, right? That's an ongoing enterprise that's taken on incredible levels of importance right now, but is always important. And I think, though, within it, you have maybe what I might call somewhere between a movement and a campaign, but opportunities to take a particular strategy or a particular approach and make it what we do in this country. And I would say ranked choice voting is sort of in that kind of movement for ranked choice voting. And when I say loosely supporting the movement, I'm kind of like, yes, let's make ranked choice voting the norm in this country. And that, to me, feels like a movement, which I'll say, by the way, we spend a lot of effort trying to win things. We do need to make them real for people. We need to spend a lot of effort that actually involves that broader democracy set of players to make it as exciting as we know it can be. And that's where ranked choice voting is only as good, only as impactful as how we make it. And that involves a lot more players. And I hope we start seeing a lot more investment in making these changes as impactful as they can be. Because we've actually at this point are a little too weighted to putting money toward winning things rather than making them as real and exciting for people that is so necessary to sustain them and to have the impact on a democracy that we want.
Well, you're a perfect example of what our country needs more of. Democracy is not a spectator sport. I mean, ultimately, if we get more and more citizens involved and engaged, even though most people don't believe they can make a change, they really can at either a local, even community level, or state or nationally, but whatever they choose to. We're running out of time, but I want to leave you with this question. If your vision came to reality in 20 years from now, 25 years from now, and many of the reforms you've been working on came to fruition, how do you see that benefiting the average American's life? What would be better about our country? What's the ultimate reason for doing all this?
No, it's obviously, it better make some positive changes. And I would say it has different kinds of impacts, and you can't promise immediate impact toward these wherever these are passed, right? And sometimes you sort of set up expectations and like, oh my gosh, this didn't happen immediately, so gosh, we got to go to the next thing. You do have to kind of dig in and make these things work and recognize, again, it will never be perfect, and you're just trying to do your best to make it as perfect as it can be. But I would say on elections, if we had the Fair Representation Act, which basically opens up every corner of the country to meaningful competition and a chance for representation, and no conversation about spoilers and, you know, that person shouldn't run. Everyone can put their hat in the ring if they want to and be incentivized to talk to voters and help bring them in, that we would see, I think, a more vibrant, inclusive election season, right? Where you would have different perspectives, a lot less of the hostility where campaigns that are close are largely negative, and then the other campaigns aren't competitive, and it's like, what a bad combination. And you can really start having a more affirmative politics where people can find a way in and new ideas can be given their fair share. That should lead to better governance, and it can lead to better governance, and you just have to create the conditions where those who are elected by that system feel rewarded for virtuous activity, like working together to get things done. And you've seen this in places, and that these systems do reward legislators, elected leaders working together better for the common good. And that doesn't mean not representing smaller interest groups which need their say, but it does mean not just being locked into kind of partisan, warfare that gets very far away from doing what's best for us. So I think you would see a lot more of that. And of course, the more we make it work by doing all the other activity that the Bridge Alliance and others do, the more it actually gets fully realized, I believe.
Well, thank you so much for your time, your vision, your work for the last 30 years, and your work hopefully for the next 30. Your optimism hopefully will excite many others who are just sitting on the couch to get involved, because that's what we need to sustain, improve, and create the healthy self-governance we all want. So thank you so much, Rob. I'm sure our audience is going to love this and hopefully become activists and involved in making our country more representative. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thanks for all you do.
My pleasure. Thank you.